Throughout history, man has exhibited infinite creativity in his ability to inflict pain on his fellow man.
You can pierce or cut. You can stretch the body. You can compress the body. You can twist the body, which is where the word torture comes from.
In our zeal to torture and punish, we've assaulted every body part, harnessed every law of physics, and corrupted every mechanical invention.
This was the illicit beauty of the instrument. It didn't kill. It destroyed your moral fiber.
The bloody legacy of torture remains one of the darkest stains of human history.
Crucifixion was truly the most horrible form of death you could possibly imagine in the ancient world.
But sifting through the remnants of where we've been and what we've done may tell us a great deal about who we are and why torture still exists to this day. Here at the Museum of Man in San Diego, California, a remarkable exhibit is drawing record-breaking crowds. Every day, hundreds of visitors queue up to view a display of the most barbaric and fiendish torture devices ever created. Most view the devices with a detached fascination. But today, walking amid the grim reality of our past, is David Gangzai, Clinical Director of Survivors of Torture International.
When I went to see the exhibition, I found myself being very disturbed, very upset, I would say traumatized. I felt sick. I felt shocked. The visceral sense of awareness of what people do to each other, what people have done to each other, and what I know that people continue to do to each other is genuinely shocking.
The sharp steel spikes, heavy stone weights, and thick leather straps may give a vivid indication of what we have done to our fellow man, but they cannot fully answer the question of why.
Torture is done for a number of reasons, and one of the most important reasons is to intimidate individuals and communities.
Basically, there are a few very simple reasons why we punish. One is deterrence, that is, we're trying to teach people a lesson. Another reason, which many people think is illegitimate, but which I think is probably the most popular one, is because people feel an urge to exact justice. The third reason, which is largely true only for capital punishment and for imprisonment, and not other forms of punishment, is what's called incapacitation. It's a very simple idea. Once you've been hanged, you're not going to do any more killing or stealing.
The best place to start to study torture or to start thinking about torture is ancient Greece. This is because the Greeks drew a fairly strong distinction between punishments that were suited for citizens and punishments that were suited for slaves.
Greek law viewed torture as fundamentally inhumane, with one glaring exception: punishing slaves. Since slaves were considered less than human, it was permissible for them to be tortured, often in place of their masters. In fact, for slaves, torture became an inevitable fact of life. If a slave testified in court, by law he had to be tortured. The Greeks felt this was the only way to ensure that his answers would be honest. The Greeks employed a wide variety of torture methods.
They could be beaten. They could be stretched on the ladder. They could be flogged in all sorts of ways. Treated with fire to the extent of being having hot iron, some hot metal, bronze perhaps, put against their flesh. Or, of course, they could be tortured by having a lot of water poured down their throats.
The ancient Greeks made no distinction between torture and punishment. This impunity led to one of the first inventions created specifically to inflict pain. In the 6th century BC, the ancient Greek king Phalaris commissioned an inventor named Perilos to create an elaborate device to execute criminals.
Attempting to appease the king, Perilos invented the brazen bull. This was an appalling device by which a metal bull-shaped creature was forged. It was set upon a pyre. The victim would be fed inside the stomach, if you like, of the bull. The door would be closed, the fire lit.
And to make it even worse, they had a device which produced the roaring of a bull. This would be in combination with the screams of the victim, which could be heard through the open nostrils of the image, until literally he was burnt to death.
Phalaris was so impatient to test the bull that he tossed Perilos inside and made him the first victim of his own invention. In ancient Greece, slaves were the first members of society to be regularly tortured. Ironically, the more civilized we would become, the more justification we would find to torture ever-increasing groups of people. By 146 BC, the Roman Empire had surpassed the Greek city-states as the world's dominant power.
The Romans were the first ones who actually gave us a legal definition of torture. Ulpian defines it as a certain kind of activity done for the sake of judicial information. So judicial torture is always tied to the development of the law. And in particular, it's focused on the determination of the truth. So in that sense, it's always been with us.
Despite these advances, Roman law was far from equitable. Clear distinctions were made between Romans and non-Romans, men and women, freedmen and slaves. The Romans were also among the first to embark on a campaign of religious persecution.
Christianity began to take off amongst slaves and poorer people, and for many years it was tolerated by the Romans alongside Judaism and various other religions which were around at the time. The more powerful Christianity became, the wider its message appealed, the more the Romans tried to suppress it.
They created grand public spectacles as both entertainment and a means to send a powerful political message.
The Romans enjoyed a public, bloody spectacle, and rather than use a slave who possibly could have had another use, they would use Christians and send forward a message that this would be what would happen to you. if you converted to Christianity.
The savage brutality of lions attacking defenseless Christians was an engaging sport, but the political message was often lost amid the carnage. So, Roman authorities borrowed more drawn-out tortures like crucifixion, which was considered a slow, humiliating way to die. Crucifixion had originally been devised by the Phoenicians in Syria over 1,000 years earlier.
Crucifixion is most familiarly associated with Jesus. We should remember that some 70 years before Jesus was born, 6,000 slaves were crucified under the direction of Nero.
The nail goes right through the center of the bone here, usually with a piece of wood that holds the person in place. And on the other hand, there's a nail about 7 inches long that goes through the 2 heels, in which both heels are nailed to the back piece of the wood. What makes this a particularly horrifying way to die is that as your hands give way, you produce an enormous amount of pressure on your chest. And there's this crushing feeling. And in order to get out of that pain, you then stand literally on the nail on which you are tied to hold yourself up and breathe again, and save the pain from your arms, which eventually your feet then give way and you fall back. And this process goes on endlessly for days until you die.
Crucifixion remained popular for over 800 years, until the 4th century AD, when the Emperor Constantine converted the entire Roman Empire to Christianity. As the Roman Empire was spreading across Europe, authorities used the threat of torture as a tool to keep an ever-growing number of subjects in line. The Romans developed the idea that punishment should somehow reflect the crime. For some crimes, the punishment was obvious. For others, like stoning, the link was less tangible.
If we explore some of these practices, we come to see that many of these societies believe that the way pollution and evil come into their societies is through the evil eye. That is to say, by casting a lustful sexual glance or letting the eye stray into the realm of the divine where it should not. These are the great violations, and it's by stoning the eye and blinding the person that we get the community back to its pure state.
We may think we are far too civilized to stone someone to death today, but the practice still exists. In this secretly shot video from the mid-1990s, 2 men are being stoned to death for committing the Islamic crime of adultery. At the same time that the Roman Empire was casting its shadow across Europe, the mysterious land of China was closed to outsiders. But behind its forbidding walls, the Chinese had turned torture into an art form.
In ancient China, they practiced death by 1,000 cuts. That's pretty self-explanatory. The victim would have various bits of flesh, slices of his arms, legs, stomach, limbs, nose, cut off slowly, piece by piece.
But they took great care, and they practiced for years, in removing slivers of flesh, strips of flesh, one at a time, very slowly, the blood pulsing out, of course, from various parts of the body, until eventually the victim was hardly recognizable as a human being. Just a bloody, gory mass of palpitating flesh. Another Chinese method was bringing death an even more incredible way, and equally hideous, that of sawing the victim in half, using an ordinary saw, 2-handle saw, such as used in this country in forestry work.
Special torture in China was reserved for monks who had forsaken their vows of celibacy.
When a monk was found guilty of fornication, a hole was drilled through his neck and a chain was passed through the hole. By this means, he was paraded through a village or a town and clearly jeered, pelted, abused by those he saw. The nature of the crime was very obvious to onlookers, and the pain that he endured was obviously immense.
China remained shrouded in mystery for thousands of years, while the Romans expanded their empire all the way into Britain. It was there that they discovered they did not hold a monopoly on cruel and inhumane treatment.
Cruel though the Romans undoubtedly were, they themselves were appalled when they visited England around the time of Caesar and then later with Claudius, and they discovered there that pagans would build huge wicker baskets in the shape of a man.
Pagan Druids and Celts allegedly created the wicker man as a human sacrifice to ward off natural disasters and plagues.
Inside those baskets they would force criminals, wrongdoers, or sometimes people in debt, people who had attracted various enmities. They were locked inside this enormous wicker man, and beneath it a fire was lit, and as such they would be burned alive. We are told the wicker men were enormous and that hundreds died at one time.
Although the Romans tried to suppress these customs, in the 5th century the Roman Empire finally collapsed under its own weight. Over the next 400 years, Britain battled Viking invaders from the north and was divided into several kingdoms. After the conquest of 1066, the Normans inherited the task of re-establishing a monarchy and unifying the legal system. But authorities had a dilemma. Medieval law did not recognize circumstantial evidence. Modern police investigation techniques were still centuries away. So how could they accurately decide who was guilty? They turned to their unwavering faith in God and a crude system of justice known as trial by ordeal.
The principle was right confers might. If you were right, you could stand the ordeal. If somebody said, I am telling the truth and I will prove I'm telling the truth by putting my hand into the fire, and it didn't burn, that proved that they were telling the truth.
The practice of trial by ordeal had its basis in Christian belief that God protected the innocent and punished the wicked, no matter how severe the conditions.
A cauldron of water was boiled, and the accused man would cast his arm up to the elbow into the water, and it was held there for a specified amount of time. The limb was withdrawn, and after 3 days, the panel who stood in judgment over him would look at his wound, and if it was sufficiently healed, they would say he had been blessed by God and was therefore innocent. However, if it was still festering and in a poor condition, he was found guilty and duly punished.
Scalding water was one test the accused could face. Others included walking over hot coals or grasping a red-hot iron. For some trials, the judgment seemed contradictory.
A person is cast in water. If they sink, they are innocent, and if they float to the top, they're guilty. This seems very strange to us because it seems like you can't win. You will lose no matter what happens. But there's actually a reason for this. What people forget is that a priest blesses the water before the individual is cast in. The water is considered holy. Therefore, it doesn't take to itself the guilty person, but casts the person out by making the person float.
Trial by ordeal created a twofold nightmare. If God established that the accused was guilty, then his fellow man was obliged to mete out horrific and often fatal punishments.
There were very early forms of hanging, which was simply a rope slung over a branch of a tree. This didn't involve a broken neck at all. This involved a very slow and unpleasant suffocation.
As misguided as it may have seemed, trial by ordeal marked the first time that a quasi-judicial system was actually employed. But the Church, however, never fully endorsed the system. Uneasy about the claims that God was rendering judgment, the Church urged defendants to confess to their crimes instead. As this need for written confession became more important, papal authority withdrew its support for trial by ordeal entirely by the 13th century. The demise of trial by ordeal did not mean that man was becoming more civilized. Capital punishment in the Middle Ages would prove to be just as grand and spectacular as anything found in ancient Rome. By the 14th century, medieval law required the accused to plead to the crimes they had been charged with.
Well, if you'd been arrested and accused of committing a crime, you would of course be taken to court. But there, a rather awkward position arose if the defendant failed to plead guilty or not guilty, because the court simply couldn't continue with the proceedings. And so they hit on rather an ingenious method of persuading you to make up your mind one way or the other.
Those who needed coercing were taken into the dungeon and pressed to plead.
You were spread-eagled, your arms and legs were tied wide apart, with only a brief covering over the essential parts, and a board was placed on your body, and on that were placed weights of increasing heaviness.
Some criminals who did confess, voluntarily or otherwise, were permanently linked to their crimes through the practice of branding.
It was made obvious to the public at large by means of having different letters on the end of a branding iron being heated up and applied to the ball of the man's thumb there.
Different letters corresponded to specific crimes. R denoted a robber, A for adulterer, B for blasphemer, and so on. After a victim was branded, he was easily identifiable, which was crucial in an age where it was difficult, if not impossible, to verify a person's identity. The legacy of branding lives on today in modern-day courtrooms. It's the reason we raise our right hand as we swear an oath onto the Bible.
And even up to comparatively recently, in Crown Courts, the judge requires the prisoner to hold his hand up. And the origin of that was so that the judge could see whether he had been previously convicted, and if so, the penalty should be duly increased.
For those who were convicted of more serious crimes, the sentence often meant death. In the heart of London, near Marble Arch, a plaque commemorates the site of one of England's busiest places of execution, Tyburn Fields.
We all feel very appalled when we think of people enjoying seeing someone suffering in their death throes, dying in a terrible way. However, we must remember that in Britain there was a long history of attending hangings. This would draw crowds of thousands and thousands of people.
Just around the corner, a small convent houses the Sisters of Tyburn. Mother John Baptist is their historian and keeper of the relics of many who died on the gallows.
The first recorded execution at Tyburn was in 1196, and for 600 years, the historians can't calculate how many men, women and children died at Tyburn.
Hanging was reserved for the commoners because the process was slow, hardly more than strangulation, and the spectacle humiliating.
Hangings took place at Tyburn every 6 weeks, and Tyburn, being in London, the main city of the country, was extremely busy. To cope with the demand, the Tyburn tree was created, which was a gibbet which held 24 nooses. So 24 criminals could be dispatched at one time.
Tyburn's first gallows were erected in the 12th century. They were replaced by the infamous Tyburn tree in 1571. Actually a triangular-shaped gallows, the structure took its name from the elm trees that were originally used to hang prisoners on the banks of the Tyburn River, which now runs underneath the city. A hanging at Tyburn meant a veritable carnival that could last for hours. Excited onlookers crowded the streets as the condemned were brought over from Newgate Prison.
It was traditional for them to stop for a drink along the way, and this, presumably, if they drank sufficiently, would dull their senses and hopefully ease their parting.
There was quite a ritual about the performance of being executed. You wore your best clothes because they went to the executioner after your death, and you wanted to be on the right side of the executioner from the beginning. The executioner wasn't a well-trained man. He might take a pride in his job and he might not. Sometimes a wealthy person being executed would pay someone well to be ready at the vital moment and run forward and jump up and swing on the condemned person, hasten death.
The last public execution at Tyburn was held in 1783. If commoners were hanged, the aristocracy were dispatched in a more dignified manner. As early as 1076, William the Conqueror had introduced death by beheading to Britain. Beheading was done by either axe or sword, and considered to be more noble than hanging because it related to dying in battle.
The axe was not a sharp, quick, clean instrument of death. It was heavy, and as such it crushed the neck rather than cut the neck. It was usual for several blows to be necessary to remove the head, obviously causing immense pain and suffering. It also depended quite a bit on the skill of the executioner, and some were better than others.
This called for a lot of cooperation by the victim, because if the victim swayed at all, then the sword would only inflict a glancing blow. So the victim had to stand or kneel, and the executioner didn't simply pick up the sword and remove the head. He had to get some impetus, some momentum behind the sword, and would so swing it in 2 or 3 arcs, then bring it round horizontally and sever the head.
King Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, was sentenced to be executed in 1536. She was allowed to choose the manner in which she would be killed. She chose to be beheaded.
A swordsman was brought over from Calais, knelt in prayer, and if you can imagine, there was no lying down and steadying of the head as there was with the axe and block. It relied on the victim kneeling or sitting very still with their neck exposed and their head upright. As she finished her prayer, very swiftly the swordsman produced his weapon, sliced off her head, and held it up as was customary, held up her head, and her eyes were seen to blink and her lips fluttered, and we can only assume that she had some notion of what had occurred.
Boleyn became the first of two of Henry's wives to lose her head. They weren't alone. During his 38-year reign, it's estimated that 72,000 people were executed. For the most blatant crimes against the crown, even hanging or beheading wasn't sufficient, such as the case with Scotsman William Wallace. Wallace, who had repeatedly embarrassed King Edward I with his military prowess, was captured in 1304 and convicted of treason. He was hung, drawn, and quartered.
The struggling, writhing victim would be cut down, laid on a bench on the scaffold. The executioner would then use his ripping knife, rip the stomach open, plunge his hand into the man's stomach and pull out all the intestines, the heart as well. He would then hold up the heart and his handful of vitals and drop them in the fire.
The sentence said that your entrails were to be burnt before your face, so that I don't know that you'd actually see them being burnt, but it was a possibility.
And the body was then cut into four. And those were taken to the cities where the man had lived as a deterrent to any locals who might have similar ideas of rising up, mutinying, rebelling against the sovereign, and they're placed on the city gates.
Wallace's head was impaled on a pole and placed on London Bridge. His limbs were scattered across the countryside from Perth to Aberdeen.
This is a way to convey, in the broadest sense of the word, what this person had done, to show that the punishment had been matched to the crime, and to send the evidence of this to the four corners of the earth.
As with hanging, drawing and quartering, it wasn't unusual in Europe for different countries to favor certain methods of torture. In France and Germany, the wheel was a popular and painful form of execution.
The poor victim was strapped onto the wheel. The wheel was slowly turned. The executioner took an iron rod and beat the body, broke the body. In the most humane version of it, there were 2 strokes to the legs to smash the legs, 2 strokes to the arms, and then the final coup de grace across the throat. But there are many cases where the pain and punishment went on for very much longer, maybe 32 or more strokes of the iron bar.
According to legend, St. Catherine of Alexandria was condemned to die on the wheel in the early 4th century, but the wheel mysteriously collapsed under her weight. The popular Catherine wheel firework commemorates this miracle. Aside from the wheel, one of the more gruesome methods of execution was the cauldron. The cauldron called for a metal bowl full of rats or mice to be placed upside down on the stomach of the victim.
And then heating the bowl, so clearly the rodents inside were in intense discomfort, and to escape the heat, they would burrow into the person, of course, heaping upon them agony and brutal humiliation and pain.
During the medieval period, even rare forays into science produced horrific results.
In medieval Europe and England, it was believed that certain parts of the body were responsible for certain kinds of criminal acts. The kidneys and the liver were popular parts of the body that were often assumed to have been the parts of the body that were related to a particular bad act, such as a rape, for example. And so it was common to have the kidneys or the liver removed, or torn out, perhaps we would say, as part of the punishment.
As hard as it is to fathom, what often scared medieval citizens wasn't torture or even death. It was the fear of having their lifeless bodies prodded and cut open in the name of science. This fear prompted the condemned to take extreme measures to ensure that their corpses were given a decent burial. By the 13th century, the power and influence wielded by the Catholic Church was in serious jeopardy. Corruption ruled the Vatican, and priests were often greedy and lascivious. Discontent festered across Europe, paving the way for numerous breakaway religious sects. Alarmed at this erosion of the Church's power, Pope Gregory IX vowed that he would eliminate heresy once and for all.
In 1215, the Pope decided that they were going to have a proper sort of inquiry, an inquisition.
Under papal authority, Dominican and Franciscan friars embarked on a ruthless crusade to expose Jews and Christian heretics.
These people were cruel beyond belief. They would enter a town parading under a crucifix. They would encourage neighbours to split upon the people next door, to tell tales. They would encourage family members to confide secrets. Those people were given a month to prove their innocence, and if they didn't confess freely and accept their punishment, then they were tortured.
The Inquisition marked a radical shift in the nature of punishment.
This couldn't happen under the old ordeal system. There was no role for judges or prosecutors, since either the person died or they didn't. If they didn't, they were right, and if they died, they were wrong. Whereas with Inquisition, we now ask the question, what is true?
The inquisitors required a confession in order to justify the Church's actions. How they acquired it was of little consequence. And the instruments they would construct to help carry out their mission would defy every law of human decency. Never before had human history witnessed such a rapid proliferation of torture devices as it did during the Inquisition.
There was the rack, there was the iron boot, things specifically devised to cause the maximum amount of pain and suffering.
All extremities of the human body are susceptible to pain, and this gave rise to the invention of a particularly painful instrument known as the boots. The victim was tied in a chair, so he couldn't move an inch. Such leather boots were placed on his feet, extending up to just below the knee, and then boiling water was poured over the boots. The leather swelled, constricting his feet.
One estimate holds that between 1481 and 1808, over 341,000 people were condemned to death in Spain alone. Yet some of the worst tortures during the Inquisition were the simplest.
The Spanish Inquisition were very fond of a certain torture which required very few implements, simply a bottle of water, or a good water supply, a funnel, and a victim securely strapped down. Male or female, it mattered not. The funnel was inserted into the victim's mouth, held in position, and water was simply poured in. At first, says Quenching, But as more and more water was poured down the victim's gullet and into the stomach, it became totally unbearable. The stomach would swell. Basically, they would be drowning internally because the water would also get into the lungs. And if the torture was maintained for any length of time, then the victim would die of drowning.
Over 200 years after the Inquisition first began, Grand Inquisitor Thomas de Torquemada created an elaborate ritual to maximize the mental and physical anguish of the Inquisition. First, the accused was threatened with his punishment. Second, the victim was shown the torture device. Next, the victim was stripped naked and strapped to the instrument. Finally, the torture commenced.
Human beings, as opposed to other creatures, have imagination. And imagination is used first by the people who were devising these persuasive methods and the design of them.
When you are terrified, your feeling of pain is very much stronger because of the combination of the pain, the lack of ability to do anything about it, and the fear that it may well continue indefinitely and quite possibly end in death.
James I, for instance, decreed that you should not simply put a person directly into the torture. He would be taken, in the case of the Tower of London, he would be taken to the basement, the dungeon of the White Tower, the great central tower. There are no outside windows, half underground. The only access was by the spiral stair. And he or she would be taken down there, and in the fitful glow of the torches attached to the walls, there they would be shown the instrument of torture. Then they would be taken back to their cell in one of the little towers of the 20 towers we have, and they would be left to think about that. That is where their imagination came in.
Devices like the Iron Maiden were so fiendish that often the mere sight of them was enough to encourage the accused to scribble a hasty confession.
It was made in two halves, like an Easter egg. The victim was forced into it. The door, as it were, the front of the model was closed. So the spikes that were on the inside of the front penetrated your body, forcing you back to impale yourself on the spikes and the rear half. There were so many spikes or knives that you were lacerated literally into pieces. Many at that stage did the obvious and sensible thing, I confess, even though basically they were innocent. If they refused to confess, then they were placed in the various torture instruments, one of which was, of course, the rack.
Elegantly simple in its design, the rack was the star attraction in many inquisitional torture chambers.
The rack started off just as a frame on which the body was stretched by having weights attached to the legs, maybe to the arms as well. And then somebody thought, well, you could put a windlass in and actually wind it a little bit at a time, more and more. And then the ratchet was invented, which made it possible for a single torturer to pull a little way and then stop, and then pull a little way more and stop. So what happens? First of all, the victim's muscles are stretched and drawn, and then the sinews go. The muscle breaks. They're desperately hanging on to the abdominal muscles, and then those go as well. The body is being stretched, the arms are being torn out of the sockets, the legs out of the hips. the man's a broken thing. He can never recover from that.
One of the rack's most notorious British victims was a Catholic sympathiser named Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was put to the rack after being caught red-handed attempting to blow up Parliament in 1605.
As the ropes creaked and the ratchet clicked and his joints were dislocated one by one, not only did he blurt out his own guilt, words, staggered, muffled groans, which were eagerly written down by the secretary at the side, but he also was forced to disclose the identity of his conspirators. And then, of course, the confession had to be signed by him in writing so appalling, hardly legible, just a scrawl, Guido Fawkes, because that was all he was capable of after the appalling distress he'd been placed in.
Fawkes and his co-conspirators were eventually put to death, and every November the 5th, Guy Fawkes Night commemorates the day that Parliament did not go up in flames. By the end of the 17th century, man had for centuries created brutal and bizarre ways to inflict pain and torture on his fellow man. But the age of enlightenment was dawning. Breakthroughs in reason, logic, science and philosophy were on the horizon, and the blurry distinction between punishment and torture was coming into focus.
And this extraordinary series continues next Tuesday night at the slightly later time of 11:10. Next tonight, secret agent excitement in another case for La Femme Nikita.